I never believed in supernatural warnings until the day I watched my grandfather die exactly 24 hours after a single black crow landed on his bedroom windowsill. That moment shattered everything I thought I knew about the world, about death, and about the ancient curse that has haunted my family for 3 generations. My name is Sarah, and this is the true story of how a death omen bird turned my entire existence into a living nightmare of anticipation and terror. It all began in the quiet suburbs of Salem, Oregon, where I grew up in a modest 2-story house with my parents, my younger brother Marcus, and our beloved grandfather Edward Mitchell. Our neighborhood was the kind of place where children rode bikes until sunset, where barbecue smoke drifted lazily through summer evenings, and where the biggest concerns were lawn care and whose turn it was to host the monthly book club. The house itself sat on Maple Street, surrounded by towering oak trees that had stood sentinel for decades, their branches creating a natural canopy that filtered sunlight into gentle dancing patterns across our front yard. Grandfather Edward was 83 years old, a retired postal worker who spent his days tending to his prize-winning rose garden and regaling us with stories from his youth. He had thick silver hair that he combed meticulously every morning, kind brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he laughed, and hands that were surprisingly steady despite his age. Every morning at exactly 7:30, he would shuffle downstairs in his worn leather slippers, brew a pot of coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and settle into his favorite chair by the kitchen window to watch the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. This routine had been his constant for as long as I could remember, and there was something deeply comforting about its reliability in an increasingly uncertain world. Let me know in the comments if you've experienced something similar with elderly family members, those precious morning rituals that anchor our days. That particular Tuesday morning in October started like any other. The autumn air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and I remember thinking how peaceful everything seemed as I prepared for another ordinary day at the local community college where I was studying nursing. Mom was rushing around the kitchen, packing lunches and checking that Marcus had his soccer cleats for practice. Dad had already left for his job at the lumber mill, his coffee mug still warm on the counter where he'd forgotten it in his haste. It was the kind of mundane morning that you never think to memorize, the kind that later becomes precious because of what followed. I was upstairs brushing my teeth when I heard Grandfather Edward's voice from downstairs, calling out in a tone I'd never heard from him before. It wasn't his usual warm greeting or his gentle humming. It was sharp, almost alarmed. "Sarah," he called, and there was something in that single word that made my blood run cold. I spit out the toothpaste, wiped my mouth quickly, and hurried downstairs, my bare feet padding softly on the worn wooden steps. The house seemed unusually quiet except for the tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a sound that suddenly seemed ominously loud in the morning stillness. I found him standing perfectly still by the kitchen window, his coffee mug forgotten in his hand, his face pale as winter snow. He was staring out at something in the backyard with an expression I'd never seen on his features before, a mixture of recognition, fear, and what I can only describe as resigned acceptance. His usually steady hands were trembling slightly, causing the coffee to create tiny ripples in the ceramic mug. When I followed his gaze through the window, I saw what had captured his attention so completely: a single black crow perched on the wooden fence that separated our property from the neighbors, its obsidian feathers gleaming like polished steel in the morning sunlight. "Grandfather, what is it?" I asked, moving to stand beside him at the window. The crow was larger than any I'd ever seen, its beak sharp and gleaming, its eyes like 2 dark marbles that seemed to hold an unsettling intelligence. It sat perfectly motionless, as if it were made of stone rather than flesh and feathers, and there was something deeply unsettling about its stillness. Most birds, I knew from casual observation, were constantly in motion, preening their feathers, shifting their weight from foot to foot, turning their heads to scan for threats or food. But this crow sat with an unnatural calm that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Hit the like button if this story is giving you chills already, because it only gets more terrifying from here. Grandfather Edward's voice was barely above a whisper when he finally spoke, his eyes never leaving the black-winged visitor. "It's him," he said, and the simple words carried a weight that seemed to press down on my chest like a physical force. "He's come for me, just like he came for my father, and his father before him." The coffee mug slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered on the linoleum floor, sending dark liquid and white ceramic shards across the kitchen tiles. The sound seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot, but the crow didn't even flinch at the noise. "What are you talking about, grandfather?" I asked, kneeling to pick up the broken pieces while trying to process what he'd just said. But even as I asked the question, something deep in my bones already knew that whatever he was about to tell me would change everything. There was a quality to the air in that moment, a heaviness that made breathing feel labored, as if the very atmosphere had become thick with impending doom. The morning sunlight streaming through the window seemed dimmer somehow, filtered through a lens of dread that I couldn't explain. He turned to look at me then, his brown eyes bright with unshed tears, and I saw a depth of sorrow there that took my breath away. "The Mitchell family curse," he said, his voice gaining strength even as his body seemed to shrink with the weight of the words. "Every generation he comes, the Black Crow. 24 hours before we die, he appears. My great-grandfather saw him in 1952, the day before his heart gave out. My grandfather saw him in 1978, perched on his hospital window the day before the cancer took him. My father saw him in 1995, sitting on our porch railing the morning before his stroke. The crow chose that moment to turn its head toward our window, and I swear those dark eyes looked directly at me with an intelligence that no bird should possess. Subscribe for more terrifying true stories like this one, because this family curse gets much darker. The rational part of my mind, the part that had been trained in science and logic through my nursing studies, immediately began searching for explanations. Coincidence, I told myself. Confirmation bias. The human tendency to find patterns where none existed. After all, crows were common in Oregon, and it wasn't unusual to see them in residential neighborhoods. They were intelligent birds, known for their problem-solving abilities and their complex social structures. Surely there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for why my grandfather was connecting the appearance of this particular crow to some kind of supernatural phenomenon. But as I watched that obsidian creature sitting motionless on our fence, something primal in my gut whispered that logic wouldn't save us from what was coming. The crow's presence felt different from any wildlife encounter I'd ever experienced. There was a purposefulness to its stillness, a sense that it wasn't simply resting or foraging, but fulfilling some ancient obligation that stretched back through generations of my family. The way it had positioned itself, facing our house directly, maintaining perfect stillness despite the typical restlessness of its species, suggested an intelligence and intentionality that defied natural explanation. "Grandfather, you're scaring me," I admitted, still crouched on the kitchen floor surrounded by coffee-stained ceramic fragments. "Surely you don't really believe that a bird can predict death. There has to be some other explanation." But even as I spoke the words, they felt hollow and inadequate against the weight of what I was witnessing. The crow continued its vigil, unmoving as a statue, its dark eyes fixed on our house with unwavering attention. Minutes passed, 5, then 10, then 15, and still it sat there, defying every instinct that should have driven it to seek food, shelter, or the company of its own kind. Mother came into the kitchen then, probably drawn by the sound of the breaking coffee mug, and stopped short when she saw our grandfather's pale face and my frightened expression. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice carrying the particular tone of alarm that mothers develop when they sense something amiss in their households. But before either of us could answer, she followed our gaze to the window and saw the crow for herself. The color drained from her face as completely as if someone had pulled a drain plug, and her hand flew to her throat in a gesture of protective alarm I'd never seen from her before. "Oh, Edward," she breathed, and I realized with a sinking heart that she knew exactly what the crow's presence meant. The knowledge was there in her eyes, in the way her shoulders sagged with the weight of recognition, in the tremor that ran through her voice. This wasn't the first time she'd heard about the Mitchell family curse, and her reaction told me that she believed in it completely. The three of us stood there in our ordinary kitchen, surrounded by the debris of a broken coffee mug, staring out at a creature that had somehow transformed our peaceful Tuesday morning into the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Paragraph 2. Paranormal activity escalation. 2,000 words. The crow remained on our fence for exactly 12 hours, never moving, never showing any sign of the typical behaviors you'd expect from a wild bird. It didn't preen its feathers, didn't shift its weight, didn't even turn its head to track the movements of other birds or the neighborhood cats that prowled through our backyard. It simply sat there like a living shadow, its black eyes fixed on our house with an intensity that made my skin crawl every time I glanced out the window. By sunset, word had somehow spread through our small neighborhood that something unusual was happening at the Mitchell house on Maple Street. Mrs. Henderson from next door was the first to knock on our front door, her weathered face creased with concern and curiosity. She was a widow in her 70s who had lived next to us for nearly 2 decades, the kind of neighbor who brought casseroles during family emergencies and always knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves. "Sarah, honey," she said, peering past me toward the kitchen window. "Is everything all right over here? I've been watching that crow all day and it just doesn't seem natural. Birds don't behave that way. In all my years, I've never seen anything like it. Comment below what you think was really happening here. Was this supernatural or something else entirely?" Behind Mrs. Henderson, I could see other neighbors gathering on the sidewalk, their voices carrying through the evening air as they discussed the strange phenomenon occurring in our backyard. Mr. Peterson, who lived 3 houses down, had brought binoculars and was taking turns with his teenage son, both of them studying the motionless crow with fascination and growing unease. The Yamamoto family from across the street stood clustered together on their porch, the parents speaking in hushed Japanese while their young daughter pointed repeatedly at our house. Inside our home, the atmosphere had grown increasingly tense as the day progressed. Grandfather Edward had spent most of the afternoon sitting in his favorite chair, not reading his usual newspaper or working on his crossword puzzles, but simply staring into space with an expression of quiet resignation that broke my heart. He'd refused lunch, refused his afternoon medication, and when I'd asked if he wanted to watch his favorite television program, he'd simply shaken his head and said, "No point now, sweetheart, no point at all." Mother had thrown herself into cleaning with a fervor that bordered on manic, scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless, reorganizing closets that were already perfectly organized, and checking and rechecking the locks on all our doors and windows as if physical barriers could somehow keep death at bay. I'd never seen her move with such frantic energy, and there was something deeply unsettling about watching my normally composed mother unravel before my eyes. Every few minutes, she would glance toward the kitchen window, her movements becoming more agitated each time she confirmed that the crow was still there. Marcus had come home from soccer practice to find our house surrounded by curious neighbors and our family in a state of barely controlled panic. At 15, he was old enough to sense that something was seriously wrong, but young enough to still maintain some skepticism about supernatural explanations. "This is insane," he said, dropping his sports bag by the front door and heading directly to the kitchen window to see the crow for himself. "It's just a bird. Why is everyone acting like it's some kind of demon or something?" But I watched his expression change as he took in the creature's unnatural stillness, the way it seemed to be studying our house with deliberate intent. The dismissive smirk faded from his face, replaced by the same uneasy recognition that had been growing in my chest all day. "Okay," he admitted quietly. "That's definitely weird. But there's got to be some logical explanation. Maybe it's sick or injured or something. Let me know if you want me to investigate this further," because the terror was just beginning. As darkness fell over Salem, Oregon, the crow's black form became even more ominous against the deepening shadows. The streetlights cast eerie pools of yellow illumination across our neighborhood, but the crow seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a void of darkness that hurt to look at directly. Our neighbors had gradually dispersed back to their own homes, but I could see lights on in windows all along Maple Street, and I knew that people were still watching, still trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Dad had returned home from work to find our family in crisis, and his practical, no-nonsense approach to life made him initially dismissive of what he termed superstitious nonsense. But as the evening wore on and the crow maintained its vigil, I watched doubt creep into his features. He was an engineer by training, a man who solved problems through logic and methodical analysis, and the crow's behavior defied every rational explanation he attempted to apply to the situation. "Animals don't act this way," he muttered, standing at the kitchen window with his arms crossed over his chest. "There's something wrong here. Maybe we should call animal control, or a veterinarian, or someone who can explain what's happening." But even as he spoke, I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the growing acknowledgement that this situation fell outside the boundaries of normal experience. At exactly midnight, the crow finally moved. Not to fly away, as we'd all been hoping, but to turn its head and look directly through our kitchen window, its dark eyes seeming to meet each of our gazes in turn. The movement was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial, and it sent a chill through my body that had nothing to do with the cool October air seeping through the window frame. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, that creature and our family stared at each other across the divide between the natural and supernatural worlds. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss any supernatural content, because this gets much more terrifying. Then, as suddenly as it had turned to face us, the crow spread its wings and lifted off into the night sky. But instead of flying away from our house as any normal bird would do, it circled our property 3 times. Slow, measured circles that seemed laden with ritual significance. On the 3rd pass, it released a sound that I can only describe as the most haunting cry I've ever heard from any living creature. It wasn't the typical caw of a crow, but something deeper, more resonant, almost like a human voice keening in grief or warning. The sound seemed to penetrate not just our ears but our very souls, leaving us all standing frozen in our kitchen, staring up at the dark shape silhouetted against the star-studded sky. When the echo of that unearthly cry finally faded, the crow disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind only the memory of its presence and the growing certainty that our lives had been irrevocably changed. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the ordinary sounds of our house, the hum of the refrigerator, the settling of wooden beams, the tick of the hallway clock. But everything felt different now, charged with an ominous energy that made even familiar sounds seem threatening. Every creak of the floorboards made me wonder if something was moving through our house. Every whisper of wind outside my window made me think the crow had returned to continue its supernatural vigil. Around 3 in the morning, I heard Grandfather Edward get up and move around downstairs. Normally, he slept soundly through the night, so I crept out of my room and peered down the staircase to see him sitting at the kitchen table, fully dressed despite the late hour. He had a pen in his hand and appeared to be writing something, his movements careful and deliberate in the dim light from the small lamp he'd turned on. When I made my way downstairs to check on him, I found him writing letters, one addressed to each member of our family, and several more addressed to old friends and distant relatives. His handwriting was shakier than usual, but still legible, and his face was calm in a way that scared me more than panic would have. "Grandfather," I whispered, not wanting to wake the rest of the household. "What are you doing?" "Saying goodbye," he replied simply, not looking up from his writing. "When the crow comes, you have 24 hours. I want to make sure I use the time wisely." The matter-of-fact way he spoke about his impending death made my throat constrict with emotion. Here was a man who had lived 8 decades, who had seen wars and peace, love and loss, joy and sorrow, and he was facing his mortality with a quiet dignity that both inspired and terrified me. "Don't talk like that," I pleaded, sinking into the chair beside him. "Maybe the crow was just a coincidence. Maybe you're wrong about what it means." But even as I spoke the words, they felt hollow and desperate. The events of the day had shaken something fundamental in my understanding of reality, and no amount of wishful thinking could restore my faith in purely logical explanations. Grandfather Edward reached over and patted my hand with fingers that felt cold as ice. "Sweet Sarah," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I've lived long enough to know the difference between coincidence and destiny. The Mitchell men have been marked by this curse for generations, and tomorrow it will be my turn to answer the call. I'm not afraid. I've had a good life, and I've been blessed with a family that loves me. That's more than many people can say. Share your own paranormal experiences in the comments section, because this family's nightmare was far from over." As dawn approached, I remained at the kitchen table with my grandfather, listening to him share stories about his father and grandfather, about the family history that had been passed down through generations, but never fully understood. According to his account, the Mitchell family had immigrated to America from Scotland in the early 1800s, carrying with them not just their possessions and dreams, but also an ancient curse that bound them to the supernatural realm through the agency of a death omen bird. "The crow isn't evil," he explained, as the first light of morning began to filter through the kitchen window. "It's more like a messenger, fulfilling an obligation that goes back further than anyone remembers. In the old country, they called creatures like this psychopomps, spirits that guide souls from the world of the living to whatever comes after. For our family, the crow serves as a warning, giving us time to prepare, to say our goodbyes, to make peace with whatever regrets we might carry." The sun rose on what would be my grandfather's final day, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink that seemed almost mockingly beautiful given the darkness that had settled over our family. As I watched the dawn break over our quiet neighborhood, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was witnessing not just another sunrise, but the end of an era for our family, the closing of a chapter that could never be reopened. Paragraph 3, Supernatural Presence, Confirmation and Intensification, 2,000 words. By 10 o'clock that morning, it became impossible to deny that something supernatural was occurring in our house. Grandfather Edward had grown noticeably weaker throughout the morning hours, not from any visible illness or injury, but as if his life force was slowly ebbing away like water draining from a bathtub. His skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality that made the blue veins beneath more prominent, and his breathing had become shallow and labored, despite the fact that he'd shown no signs of respiratory distress the day before. But it wasn't just his physical deterioration that confirmed the supernatural nature of what we were experiencing. At exactly 10:15, every clock in our house stopped simultaneously. The grandfather clock in the hallway, the digital alarm clocks in our bedrooms, the microwave clock in the kitchen, even the battery-powered watch on my wrist. All of them frozen at the same moment, as if time itself had decided to pause in recognition of the otherworldly forces at work in our home. Mother discovered the phenomenon first, rushing from room to room in growing panic as she confirmed that every timepiece in the house had stopped at the exact same instant. "This isn't possible," she kept repeating, her voice rising with each repetition. "Clocks don't just stop like this. There has to be an explanation." But even as she spoke, I could see the acceptance growing in her eyes, the reluctant acknowledgement that we were dealing with something far beyond the realm of normal experience. The temperature in the house began to drop next, despite the fact that it was a relatively warm October day and our heating system was functioning normally. The cold wasn't the ordinary chill you might feel from an open window or inadequate insulation. It was a bone-deep cold that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves, as if the very structure of our home was being invaded by some Arctic presence. We could see our breath forming small clouds in the air, and frost began to form on the inside of our windows despite the sunshine streaming through them from outside. Comment below if you've experienced supernatural temperature drops like this, because it gets much worse. Dad had called in sick to work, unable to concentrate on anything besides the inexplicable events unfolding in our home. He spent the morning checking and rechecking our heating system, testing electrical connections, and searching for any rational explanation for the simultaneous clock failure and dramatic temperature drop. But his engineering expertise proved useless against forces that operated outside the laws of physics and logic. "None of this makes sense," he said, his breath visible as he spoke. "The furnace is working perfectly, the electrical system is fine, and I can't find any reason why the temperature would drop like this. It's like the house itself is dying." His choice of words sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the supernatural cold filling our home. Because in a way, he was right. Our house was dying, or at least preparing for death, transforming itself into a space between worlds where the boundaries between life and death became permeable. Marcus had initially tried to maintain his skeptical stance, insisting that there had to be scientific explanations for everything we were witnessing. But by noon, even his teenage pragmatism couldn't withstand the mounting evidence that something impossible was happening. When he attempted to leave the house to go to his friend's place, every door in our home refused to open, no matter how hard he pulled on the handles or checked the locks. The windows wouldn't budge either, as if they'd been sealed shut by some invisible force. "We're trapped," he said, his voice cracking with the first real fear I'd heard from him since the crisis began. Something doesn't want us to leave, and he was right. Whatever supernatural presence had taken control of our house seemed determined to keep our entire family together for the duration of Grandfather Edward's final day, forcing us to witness every moment of the supernatural transition that was occurring. Let me know if you want a part 2 to this story, because the supernatural manifestations were about to become much more intense. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we began to hear voices. Not human voices, but something else entirely. Whispers that seemed to drift through the walls themselves, speaking in languages that sounded ancient and otherworldly. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakably mournful, as if we were overhearing conversations between spirits gathering to escort my grandfather to whatever realm awaited him. The whispers grew louder and more frequent as the day progressed, sometimes seeming to emanate from the walls, sometimes from the ceiling, sometimes from beneath our feet. They created an audio landscape of supernatural activity that made normal conversation nearly impossible and filled our home with an atmosphere of otherworldly anticipation. Grandfather Edward was the only one among us who seemed unafraid of the voices. In fact, I noticed him occasionally nodding as if he could understand what they were saying, as if he was participating in conversations that the rest of us couldn't comprehend. "Who are they, Grandfather?" I asked during a brief lull in the supernatural chatter. "What are they saying?" He turned to look at me with eyes that seemed to be seeing far beyond the physical boundaries of our kitchen, his expression peaceful despite the chaos surrounding us. "They're my family," he said simply. "My father, my grandfather, and all the Mitchell men who came before. They're here to welcome me, to help me make the transition. The voices you're hearing are their way of letting me know that I won't be alone when the time comes. His calm acceptance of what was happening was both comforting and terrifying. Here was a man who was literally surrounded by supernatural phenomena, facing his own death, and yet he seemed more at peace than any of us who would continue living. The supernatural activity intensified as afternoon faded toward evening. Shadows began moving independently of their sources, sliding across walls and floors with purposeful direction that defied the laws of light and physics. Objects throughout the house started shifting positions when no one was looking. Family photographs turning themselves face down, books rearranging themselves on shelves, furniture sliding across floors with soft scraping sounds that set our teeth on edge. Hit the like button if this story gave you chills, because we're approaching the most terrifying part. Most disturbing of all were the reflections in our mirrors and windows. Instead of showing our familiar faces in the interior of our home, the reflective surfaces began displaying scenes from what appeared to be other times and places. I glimpsed shadowy figures in old-fashioned clothing walking through rooms that looked like our house but weren't quite right, as if we were seeing into parallel versions of our reality, where different choices had been made and different lives had been lived. In the bathroom mirror, I saw a young man who looked remarkably like my grandfather, standing in what appeared to be the same room but furnished with antiques from decades past. He was staring directly at the mirror as if he could see me watching him, and his lips were moving as if he was trying to communicate something urgent across the barrier between our worlds. When I called for the others to come and see, the reflection faded, leaving only my own frightened face staring back at me from the ordinary surface of the glass. Mother had the most disturbing mirror encounter of all. While washing dishes in the kitchen sink, she glanced up at the window above and saw not our backyard, but what appeared to be a cemetery filled with weathered headstones and gnarled trees. Among the graves, she could make out figures in dark clothing standing in small groups, all of them facing toward our house as if they were waiting for something. When she blinked and looked again, the cemetery was gone, replaced by our ordinary suburban backyard. But the image had shaken her so profoundly that she was unable to speak for nearly an hour afterward. "They're gathering," Grandfather Edward explained when we told him about the mirror visions. "The boundary between worlds is thinning as my time approaches. Sometimes when death is near, the veil lifts enough for the living to glimpse what lies beyond. What you're seeing are the places and people that exist in the realm I'll be joining soon." His matter-of-fact explanation did little to ease our terror, but it helped us understand that we weren't losing our minds. We were witnessing something that had been happening to the Mitchell family for generations. As evening approached, the supernatural manifestations reached a crescendo that left us all huddled together in the living room, afraid to separate even for a moment. The whispered voices had become so numerous and constant that they created a background symphony of otherworldly communication. The temperature had dropped so dramatically that we could see thick layers of frost forming on every surface, and our breath created dense clouds that hung in the air like fog. The house itself seemed to be transforming around us, becoming less a home and more a threshold between worlds. Share this video with someone who loves horror stories, because this family curse was about to claim another victim. But perhaps most unsettling of all was the change in Grandfather Edward himself. As the supernatural activity intensified around us, he seemed to become more translucent, as if he was already beginning to fade from our physical reality. I could see through him to the chair he was sitting in, and when he reached out to touch my hand, his fingers felt insubstantial, like trying to grasp smoke or shadow. "It's almost time," he said, as the sun began to set outside our frost-covered windows. "The crow will return soon, and when it does, I'll be ready." And somehow, despite all the supernatural chaos surrounding us, despite the terror and disbelief and desperate hope that maybe we were all sharing the same nightmare, I knew that he was right. The death omen bird would return to complete the supernatural process. It had begun exactly 24 hours earlier, and our family would never be the same. Paragraph 4, the climax, direct confrontation and supernatural terror, 2,000 words. At exactly the same moment the sun disappeared behind the horizon, plunging our supernatural-infested house into darkness, the black crow returned. But this time, it wasn't alone. Through our frost-covered windows, we could see dozens of crows filling our backyard, perched on every available surface: the fence, the trees, the roof of our garden shed, even the ground itself. They sat in perfect silence, their dark forms creating an audience of death omens that stretched across our entire property like living shadows cast by some unseen flame. The original crow, the one we now recognized as our family's specific harbinger, landed directly on the windowsill outside our living room, its obsidian eyes reflecting the lamplight from within our house like two burning coals. But something was different about it now. Where yesterday it had appeared as a normal bird, albeit one behaving in an unnatural manner, tonight it seemed larger, more substantial, radiating a presence that felt ancient and terrible and utterly beyond human comprehension. "Dear God," Mother whispered, her hand pressed against her throat as she stared at the supernatural assembly gathered in our backyard. "There are so many of them. What do they want?" But even as she asked the question, we all knew the answer. They had come for Grandfather Edward, not as malevolent forces, but as an otherworldly escort preparing to guide him across the threshold between life and death. The temperature in our house plummeted to sub-zero levels, causing the frost on our windows to thicken into sheets of ice that distorted our view of the Crow congregation outside. Our breath came in thick, visible clouds that seemed to linger in the air longer than physically possible, creating a fog that made our familiar living room feel like an alien landscape. The supernatural whispers that had been haunting us throughout the day suddenly stopped, replaced by a silence so complete and profound that it felt like the entire universe was holding its breath. Then the original Crow began to speak. Not in human words, but in sounds that somehow conveyed meaning directly to our minds, bypassing our ears entirely and implanting understanding straight into our consciousness. The communication was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Part telepathy, part emotional transmission, part ancient knowledge being downloaded into my brain at the speed of thought. And what it told us about our family's curse was more terrifying than anything we could have imagined. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because this supernatural revelation will change everything you thought you knew about death omens. The Crow's mental voice revealed that the Mitchell family curse wasn't random. It was the result of an ancient pact made by my great-great-great-grandfather in Scotland during the potato famine of the 1840s. Facing starvation and desperate to save his family, he had made a deal with what he believed was a benevolent spirit, trading his bloodline's natural death for the gift of supernatural warning. But the entity he'd bargained with wasn't benevolent at all. It was something far older and more complex than human understanding could fully grasp. A being that existed between the worlds of the living and the dead, feeding on the emotional energy generated by anticipation, grief, and supernatural terror. For generations, it had been using our family as a renewable source of psychic nourishment, marking each male Mitchell for a death preceded by 24 hours of escalating supernatural activity that created the exact type of emotional intensity it craved. The Crow's revelation came with vivid mental images that flashed through our consciousness like a supernatural slideshow. I saw my great-great-great-grandfather, gaunt with hunger, kneeling in a stone circle on a Scottish hillside, while a massive crow, the same crow that now perched on our windowsill, materialized from shadow and smoke. I witnessed the moment he agreed to the bargain, not understanding that he was condemning every male in his lineage to become prey for an otherworldly predator that masqueraded as a harbinger of natural death. Edward Mitchell, the Crow's mental voice resonated through our minds with the weight of centuries. Your time has come. The pact must be honored. The cycle must continue. But for the first time since this supernatural nightmare began, my grandfather didn't simply accept his fate with quiet resignation. Instead, he stood up from his chair, and as he rose, his translucent form began to solidify, gaining substance and presence in a way that defied everything we'd witnessed throughout the day. "No," he said, and his voice carried an authority I'd never heard from him before. "Not anymore. This ends with me." The Crow's obsidian eyes widened in what appeared to be genuine surprise, and the entire congregation of death omens in our backyard shifted restlessly, their perfect stillness broken for the first time since their arrival. Comment below what you think happened next, because this supernatural confrontation was about to take an unexpected turn. Grandfather Edward began to glow with a soft, golden light that seemed to emanate from within his very cells, pushing back against the oppressive supernatural darkness that had invaded our home. The frost on our windows began to melt, the temperature started to rise, and the suffocating atmosphere of otherworldly dread that had been crushing us slowly began to lift. "I've spent my entire life researching our family history," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I know about the pact, about what that creature really is, and I know about the one thing it never told my great-great-great-grandfather. The bargain can be broken, but only by someone willing to sacrifice themselves not in death, but in a different way entirely." The Crow let out a sound that was part screech, part human scream, and part something else entirely. The sound of an ancient predator realizing its prey had discovered the weakness in what seemed like an unbreakable supernatural contract. The other crows in our backyard began to caw frantically, their perfect formation dissolving into chaotic movement as they sensed their master's distress. The pact required the willing sacrifice of our bloodline, Grandfather Edward continued, the golden light around him growing brighter and more intense. But it never specified that the sacrifice had to be death. I'm willing to give my life force, my remaining years, my very essence, not to feed this creature, but to sever the connection it has to our family forever. What happened next defied every law of physics and supernatural lore I thought I understood. Instead of the life energy flowing from my grandfather to the otherworldly entity as it had for generations of Mitchell men, the process reversed. The golden light surrounding him began to spread outward, flowing toward the crow on our windowsill and enveloping it in radiance that seemed to cause it actual pain. The creature that had masqueraded as a death omen for over a century began to change, its black feathers falling away to reveal something underneath that was neither bird nor shadow, but something far more ancient and terrible. It was a writhing mass of darkness and hunger, a thing made of pure need and supernatural appetite that had been feeding on my family's terror and grief for generations. Like this video if you're getting major chills right now, because the supernatural battle was reaching its climax. The entity fought against my grandfather's sacrifice, sending waves of psychic energy through our house that shattered every remaining piece of glass and caused the walls themselves to crack and splinter. But Grandfather Edward held firm, pouring his life force into the battle not to preserve his own existence, but to break the supernatural chains that had bound our family for so long. "I won't let it take Marcus," he gasped, his form becoming more translucent as he gave everything he had to the fight. "I won't let it take any more Mitchell men. This ends now, this ends with me, and it ends forever." The golden light reached a crescendo that turned our entire house into a beacon visible for miles, a supernatural lighthouse announcing the end of an ancient curse. The entity let out one final, reality-shaking scream of rage and defeat before dissolving into nothingness, taking with it every crow in our backyard and leaving behind only ordinary October darkness. The supernatural cold vanished instantly, replaced by normal autumn temperatures. The stopped clocks throughout our house resumed their ticking. The whispered voices fell silent forever. But the victory came at a cost that broke our hearts, even as it freed our family from generations of supernatural bondage. Paragraph 5. The resolution and lasting horror. 2,000 words. Grandfather Edward collapsed the moment the entity was destroyed, his sacrifice complete, but his body utterly depleted by the supernatural battle he'd fought on behalf of every future generation of Mitchell men. We rushed to his side, but even as we cradled his weakened form, we could see that he was fading, not from supernatural predation, but from the natural consequence of pouring his life force into breaking an otherworldly curse. "Did we win?" he whispered, his voice barely audible but carrying a note of hope that hadn't been present since the crow first appeared on our fence. "Is it over?" His eyes searched our faces desperately, needing to know that his sacrifice had accomplished what generations of Mitchell men before him had been unable to achieve. "Yes, Grandfather," I said through my tears, holding his hand as his breathing became more shallow. "It's over. The curse is broken. Marcus will never have to face what you faced. None of us will." A smile crossed his weathered features, the first genuine smile we'd seen from him since this supernatural nightmare began 48 hours earlier. "Good," he breathed. "That's all I wanted. To break the chain. To set our family free." His eyes closed then, and for a moment we thought we'd lost him, but his chest continued to rise and fall, weak but steady, and we realized that unlike every Mitchell man before him, he wasn't going to die from his encounter with the supernatural. The curse had been broken, but at the cost of years, perhaps decades, of his remaining natural life. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, because what happened next changed our understanding of sacrifice and family forever. Over the following weeks, Grandfather Edward slowly recovered from his supernatural ordeal, though he was forever changed by the experience. The golden light that had surrounded him during his battle with the otherworldly entity never completely faded, leaving him with a subtle luminescence that was visible only to family members and those sensitive to supernatural energy. More importantly, he retained memories and knowledge from his psychic connection with the entity during its destruction. He could now see and communicate with the spirits of our ancestors, not as haunting presences, but as guides and protectors who had been trying for generations to help us break free from the supernatural predator that had been masquerading as a family tradition. "They're all here," he told us one evening as we sat together in our living room, now free from the oppressive atmosphere that had characterized our home during the supernatural crisis. "My father, my grandfather, and all the Mitchell men who came before, they're not bound to the curse anymore. They're free to move on to whatever comes next, but they wanted me to tell you something first." We leaned in eagerly, hungry for any communication from the family members we'd lost over the years to what we'd believed was an inescapable supernatural fate. Grandfather Edward's eyes took on the distant look that we'd learned meant he was receiving information from beyond the veil between worlds. "They want you to know that breaking the curse didn't just free our family, it freed them too. They've been trapped for generations, unable to move on because they were still connected to the entity that fed on their deaths. Now they can finally rest, finally find peace, finally continue their journey to whatever lies beyond this world." Hit the like button if this story gave you hope along with the horror, because sometimes love and sacrifice can overcome even supernatural evil. The most profound change in our family came in the form of Marcus, my younger brother, who had been destined to face his own supernatural death omen in 60 or 70 years. The night after the curse was broken, he experienced a vivid dream in which every Mitchell man who had ever lived appeared to him, not as harbingers of doom, but as a celebration of freedom. "They thanked me," he told us the next morning, his 15-year-old face glowing with an emotional maturity that seemed far beyond his years. All of them, going back generations. "They thanked me for being the first Mitchell man who would never have to fear the crow, who would never have to spend his life waiting for a supernatural death sentence. They said I could live naturally, love fully, and die in my own time, according to natural law rather than otherworldly predation." But perhaps the most significant revelation came when we discovered that we weren't the only family that had been affected by similar supernatural contracts. Word of our successful battle against the otherworldly entity spread through networks of people who study paranormal phenomena, and we began to receive letters and phone calls from other families around the world who had been trapped in comparable supernatural situations. There were the Williamses in Louisiana, whose family had been cursed with prophetic nightmares that drove them to madness. The Kowalskis in Pennsylvania, whose ancestors had made a pact that caused every third generation to be born with the ability to see violent deaths before they occurred. The Nakamuras in California, whose family line was bound to an entity that manifested as butterflies before tragic accidents claimed their loved ones. "We're not alone," Mother realized as the letters continued to arrive. "There are families all over the world who have been trapped by these ancient supernatural contracts. And now that we know it's possible to break them, maybe we can help others find their freedom too." Comment below if you know of any family curses or supernatural situations that need to be broken, because our story was just the beginning. This realization led to the formation of what we privately called the Liberation Network, a loose organization of families and individuals dedicated to researching, understanding, and breaking supernatural contracts that had trapped bloodlines for generations. Grandfather Edward, despite his weakened condition, became one of the primary researchers and advisors, using his retained connection to the spiritual realm to help other families identify the true nature of their supernatural bondage. Over the following months, we successfully helped break curses affecting dozens of families across 6 different countries. Each battle was different, each supernatural entity had its own weaknesses and requirements, but the principle remained the same. Most of these ancient pacts could be broken by willing sacrifice that subverted the original terms of the supernatural contract. The Williamses were freed when their eldest daughter chose to experience one final prophetic nightmare that showed her not just a death, but the way to prevent it, breaking the cycle of helplessness that had fed their spiritual predator for over 2 centuries. The Kowalskis found liberation when their family's current psychic chose to use her abilities not to passively witness violence, but to actively prevent it, transforming from supernatural victim to supernatural warrior. But not every family we tried to help was successful in breaking their supernatural bonds. Some of the entities were too powerful, some of the contracts too ironclad, some of the families too divided to mount the unified spiritual resistance necessary to achieve liberation. We learned that breaking supernatural curses required not just knowledge and courage, but perfect timing, absolute commitment, and sometimes a level of sacrifice that families weren't prepared to make. "We can't save everyone," Grandfather Edward told me during one of our research sessions, his voice heavy with the weight of recent failures. "Some of these supernatural contracts are too old, too complex, too deeply woven into the fabric of reality itself. But every family we do help, every curse we break, weakens the overall network of otherworldly predators that feed on human suffering. Subscribe for more true supernatural stories, because our family's battle against otherworldly evil was far from over. The most disturbing discovery we made during our research was that the supernatural entities preying on human families weren't isolated phenomena. They were part of a vast, interconnected network of otherworldly predators that had been feeding on human emotional energy for millennia, using ancient contracts and supernatural curses to create renewable sources of the terror, grief, and despair they required for sustenance. Breaking individual curses didn't just free specific families, it damaged the entire supernatural ecosystem, forcing other entities to work harder to maintain their food sources and occasionally causing some of the weaker predators to abandon their human prey entirely in search of easier targets. We were, in effect, waging a shadow war against creatures that existed in the spaces between life and death, reality and nightmare, natural law and supernatural chaos. This is bigger than we initially realized, I told our small group of curse breakers during one of our monthly meetings. We're not just helping individual families, we're fighting a battle for the spiritual freedom of humanity itself. Every curse we break, every family we liberate, makes it harder for these entities to maintain their hold on our world. The irony wasn't lost on any of us, that by breaking our own supernatural curse, we had inadvertently committed ourselves to a lifetime of supernatural warfare. But unlike our ancestors, who had been victims of otherworldly predation, we were choosing to be warriors in a battle that most people didn't even know was being fought. As I finish telling you this story today, 3 years after the crow first appeared on our fence, I can report that the Mitchell family remains free from supernatural bondage. Marcus is now 18, attending college, and living the normal life that had been denied to generations of Mitchell men before him. He has never seen a death omen bird, never experienced supernatural warnings about his mortality, never spent sleepless nights wondering when his family's curse would finally claim him. But our work continues. The Liberation Network has grown from a handful of freed families to a worldwide organization dedicated to identifying and breaking supernatural contracts that trap human bloodlines in cycles of otherworldly predation. We've learned that these ancient pacts are far more common than anyone realizes, hidden behind family traditions, cultural superstitions, and unexplained patterns of tragedy that span generations. If you've experienced supernatural warnings in your own family, if you've noticed patterns of unusual death or tragedy that seem to follow bloodline connections, if you've heard stories about family curses that everyone treats as folklore but no one quite dismisses entirely, know that you're not alone, and more importantly, know that freedom is possible. The otherworldly predators that have been feeding on human families for centuries want us to believe that supernatural contracts can never be broken, that ancient curses are eternal and unchangeable. But our story, and the stories of dozens of other families we've helped, proves that love, sacrifice, and determination can overcome even the most powerful supernatural bondage. Hit that notification bell and share this video with anyone who needs to hear this message, because somewhere out there, another family is facing their own death omen bird, and they need to know that the curse can be broken, that freedom is possible, and that they don't have to face their supernatural nightmare alone. The Mitchell family curse is over, but our fight for spiritual liberation has just begun. The end. If this story resonated with you, if you've experienced similar paranormal phenomena, or if you know someone who might be trapped in a supernatural situation, please share this video and let them know that hope exists even in the darkest supernatural circumstances. Sometimes the most powerful force against otherworldly evil is simply knowing that you're not alone in the battle. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more true supernatural stories that explore the hidden wars being fought between the natural and supernatural worlds. Your support helps us reach more families who might need to hear that freedom from ancestral curses is not only possible, it's happening all around the world, one liberated bloodline at a time.